I'm Natalie Sexton with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, one of the sponsors of this seminar series. So we haven't had it over at USGS for a while, so this is a really great turnout, better than our last CSU one, so go USGS. This series is a partnership with USGS and the Park Service and Colorado State University. What's your new name of your department?
Journalism and Media Communication.
And the U.S. Forest Service Research Station. And so we usually try to do at least a few of these a semester, and hopefully you all are on our listserv, and if not, we'll be passing something around. We're actually working on revamping the website where you'll be able to see the announcements for the upcoming ones, as well as link to the recordings as we get those. We started a year or so ago actually having a web component to this. So folks who are on the web, feel free to chat any questions in the chat box. We'll be taking some clarifying questions in between the two presentations, and then we'll open it up for discussion at the end. So today our topic is understanding drivers of human and animal behavior to inform wildlife management. And we have two really interesting talks from Kirsten Leong with the National Park Service and Jackie Keating with the Fish and Wildlife Service, and also a master's student at Utah State University. So just to give you a little bit background of each of those women. Kirsten is the Program Manager for Human Dimensions of Biological Resource Management at the National Park Service. And we get to work in the same building every day, which is great. We used to just see each other at conferences outside of Fort Collins, so it's really nice to meet once a month and collaborate. And her program helps parks across the country use social science to better understand how people think and interact with resources in the parks. Prior to her PhD in Human Dimensions, she received a master's in wildlife ecology and conservation with an emphasis on animal behavior. And Jackie is visiting. She's actually volunteering with the Human Dimensions branch in our office last week and this week, so really excited to have her around and hear more about her research and helping us with some training that we're hoping to do up in our Alaska region. She's a research assistant at Utah State University in their sociology department, and she's been working with one of our refuges in Alaska, Kodiak National Wildlife Refuge, since 2013 as an intern, park ranger, and researcher, and is finishing a thesis on the human dimensions of bear-dependent tourism in Kodiak. And we were talking earlier today, and what's kind of cool is that because of some social science influence early in their comprehensive conservation planning process, our 15-year plan, they were able to identify the need for some social science research on this issue, which really set Jackie up well, and obviously your influence in working with the refuge to do this research. So thank you guys, and I'll turn it over to you, Kristen.
Thanks, Natalie. Great. Well, as you can see, I'll be sort of setting the stage by talking a bit about, let's see if I can do this correctly. Maybe turn that on, that would help. Managing human and wildlife interactions, and really drawing from both sides principles of human behavior change as well as animal behavior change. And that was sort of why I put in that little bit about my master's being around animal behavior, because that's where we're going to start. And the specific context that we're looking at is representative of a lot of the national parks in the country, but also a lot of other protected areas in the North American context, where animals have really been in an environment where they're not pursued by people, and people are coming to enjoy the resources and have a great wildlife viewing experience. And so when people are looking for wildlife and wildlife are protected, it sets up this dynamic where animals learn that they're in that safe environment, they learn from their interactions with people, and that also affects the way that people then start to think about the wildlife in those contexts, and there's sort of a positive feedback loop where they're learning from each other and changing their behavior accordingly. So that's what I'll be talking about. Starting with managing animal behavior, this is an area that in the Park Service, a group of people, and this was before I even started kind of thinking about the issue, and managers were starting to bring it up, especially around a piece of our management policies It talks about managing for animal populations, but one specific aspect that was called out was managing, preserving and restoring natural behaviors of animal populations. And some people started asking, what exactly does that mean, natural behaviors? Is it the natural learning process that's going on, or is it the behavior that the animal's expressing that we perceive as natural? And as we kind of started talking about it, we've come more towards the latter, because whatever an animal is doing is a natural behavior. It's a natural expression of behavior. Sorry, a natural learning process that's being expressed. One other thing that we're looking at was that there is clear consensus by the scientific and management community that food conditioning is not something that we desire in parks and sort of in other contexts usually too. But we started thinking about what other kinds of animal behaviors might change from interactions with people. And that's where we often hear the confusion between the terms habituation and food conditioning. And that's when it was sort of thought, we need to really be drawing on the animal behavior literature to really tease apart those differences. So since I've been with the Park Service, I came on permanently in 2007, we've had various different groups of managers and regional biologists and folks across the country that have been helping us think about this idea, focusing on different pieces of it. And most recently, we've kind of developed a framework with some guiding principles and concepts that help us think through and diagnose what's going on in a situation. So that's what I'm going to share with you today. Some of the key foundational concepts that we felt like we needed to make sure we're all on the same page as we were thinking about these, they seem pretty basic, but just to make sure we're all starting at the same place. The idea that animals respond to stimuli in the environment, that those stimuli can have consequences. They don't have to, but they can. And then repeated exposure to stimuli with the same consequences over time is how that results in learning. So that's that natural process again. The animals are learning naturally. There's nothing unnatural about being able to learn. And that's also one way that they adapt to their environment. And this also happens at the individual level. It can also happen through social learning, where you have adults teaching offspring, or you have animals watching and learning from each other. And there can be populations that are learning sort of simultaneously. But what we're really interested in most of the time is we get these problem animals or problem individuals or nuisance animals that need to be managed. And so it's really thinking about what is the process that's led that animal to behave in that way that needs to be addressed. So as we started to think about the processes of habituation and conditioning, we're all scientists, so we like to look at things on graphs. And that actually helped conceptually quite a bit to think about, if we look at the response of an animal to people, and we think about the response possibly ranging from no response at all to an attraction or avoidance or attraction response, those are really the kinds of things that we're concerned about. When are animals starting to approach people? When are they sort of naturally running away? And how is that response changing as they have more exposure to humans in a protected area context? So if you look at the definition from an animal behavior perspective, the textbook definition of habituation, that's when there's a stimulus that doesn't have any consequence. And so because it doesn't have consequences, over time the animal's response weakens. They learn that there's really no benefit to reacting to that stimulus. And that can either be an initial avoidance or attraction response. Either way, when the animal learns there's no benefit from that response, that's when it habituates and it stops responding. In the Park Service context, and I think probably for a lot of wildlife managers, it's really the loss of a fear response that is of more concern to managers. It's when animals stop running away from people. If animals stop being attracted to people, managers don't really worry too much about that. On the opposite side, and this is what it sort of looks like playing out in photographs. The initial reaction might be to run away for a new stimulus, but over time, or over repeated exposures, those animals learn that that's not really benefiting them to run away. There's no threat that they're running from, and then they just stop reacting. So then on the other side, you have conditioning. And this is a different kind of learning process where the stimulus does have positive or negative consequences. And so the animal's response strengthens because it's getting some reinforcement of being around, either being around that person or from running away from that person. So an initial response could either become strengthened in the positive direction, that's positive conditioning, or in the negative direction, that's negative conditioning. And again, in the Park Service, usually what we're most concerned about is seeking rewards from people when an animal start becoming more aggressive, coming towards people more frequently. And usually it's food that's the reward. It doesn't always have to be. We've seen places where there's salt on roads or on cars, or urine on trails that becomes a mineral salt attractant. So there can be other things that are perceived as rewards, but it's usually food that we worry about. And again, what this looks like, an animal might initially just be curious around an area like a campground, but then once it learns that there are food rewards there, it starts to aggressively look for those rewards and seek people out. So when we start to think about what does this look like in a framework, we borrowed some ideas that I'll be talking about next with human behavior, some different steps of thinking about which behavior you're trying to address and how you will go about doing that. And so for each of these, we tried to come up with some diagnostic questions and some principles to help us think through the different stages. The first being, is there, which behavior are you really interested in? Is it habituation or conditioning? And is that behavior a symptom of a broader systematic problem? So I'll talk about each of those in turn. First, I wanted to kind of put together those ideas that we talked about, and this gets back, it's trying to tease out, is it habituation or conditioning? And if you think about those two behaviors that we just talked about and the aspects that are of concern to managers, you see what ends up looking like a continuum, sort of escalating continuum, but it's really moving through two different behavior or learning processes, where an animal's response might initially be this wild or flight response. And this is when we put it in these sympathetic quotes, because we realize it's our perception of that being wild, right, that we want to maintain. It's not that it's inherently wild. It's inherently wild for an animal to learn about its environment and change its behavior from that. So, but this is the desired behavior that we wanted to see. And once the animals then start to lose that fear response and become habituated, that sets up a situation where there's more of an opportunity to get those food rewards, and then the food rewards result in the conditioned behavior where they're seeking out that reward actively. So the other thing here is that because one is enforced by a reward and the other one, habituation, is the absence of any consequence, it's very, very hard to break that conditioned response. When you remove the food reward, even an infrequent reward will still reinforce that behavior. So it doesn't take a lot to keep an animal conditioned. Whereas habituation, when they're habituated, if they get any kind of stimulus, any type of consequence, either positive or negative, it starts to push them in one direction or the other, either positive or negative conditioning. So that's a bit more of a fragile kind of state to maintain, whereas conditioning, once you're there, it's very hard to break that. And so that's why it's very important to be proactive and try not to get to that food conditioned state. Again, thinking about, is this behavior that's a problem, is that a source or a symptom? Is it that the bear is breaking into food, or is it that there's unsecured food at the campground? And if there's unsecured food, even if you were to remove that individual animal, you might solve the immediate problem, but you have a systemic issue where another bear is going to come in and get food conditioned, and that's not really a good way to approach conservation or stewardship. So again, our principles that try to go along with that step: always have a plan before you act. That was even before we kind of got into the steps. We wanted to make sure people were thinking about having a plan before you act. Being proactive, not waiting until an animal is food conditioned, and really thinking about what's going on with the rest of the environment. Are there human behaviors at the root of the problem that need to be managed as well? Moving into the next step, it's very related. It's what is the stimulus of interest? So that again is related to the kind of behavior that's being expressed. And then also thinking about, are certain animals more easily attracted or deterred from that stimulus? And I'll talk about what these mean in a little more detail. The first, to inform that first piece, what's the stimulus of interest, is this idea called the Garcia Effect, which is really helpful. It's not when you have a whole bunch of dead heads that show up at your park, but it's work that's been done by Garcia and colleagues looking at the way that animals process learning stimuli. And so what they actually found was that animals were able to associate sound with pain and taste with nausea, but they weren't able to translate that vice versa. So they weren't able to associate sound with nausea. And the reason this is important for wildlife management is that most of our aversive conditioning tools that we have, if we're trying to teach, provide a negative stimulus to have that animal have a fear response, the tools that we have typically are things like rubber bullets or bean bags or flattery or air horns, things that have that sound-related and pain-related stimulus. That's not going to teach an animal to not be attracted to the food. You might teach an animal to move away from the area. You might teach an animal to move away from the people that are providing that stimulus, but it's still going to be attracted to the food. It just might seek it out somewhere else. So if you're using those aversive conditioning techniques, you might be able to provide some immediate relief, short-term relief, but it's not really addressing the underlying problem. For taste, there's a technique called conditioned taste aversion that can be used to teach animals to associate a food source with nausea. That's what happens often, like people experience this if you happen to get the flu, like get a stomach flu and then eat something and then you can never eat that food again because you associate that with being sick. It's the same process that happens in animals, but it's not really generalizable. It's really associated with that specific food source. So if you're trying to teach animals to stay away from human food, you'd have to apply a chemical that induces a nausea response to every kind of human food they might be exposed to, and that's not really practical. So it can be used in very limited situations if it's a very specific food source that the animal's being attracted to, but ideally you wouldn't want one to be the food that the animal relies on, and you wouldn't want something that you're trying to get the animal to generalize on. It doesn't work that way. So we don't really recommend conditioned taste aversion for human food ever. Individual animal temperament is one that's been it's being talked about more recently in the literature, and this is recognizing that just like people, animals within a species or population have temperaments that can range on a continuum from shy to bold. And so there's a wildlife biologist in Canada, Mike Jabot, and he likes to say that when you run into a bear, you don't know if you're meeting Mary Poppins or Charlie Manson. And so it's just something to keep in mind. If you have an individual animal that you need to manage, you really need to know which animal is it that was involved, what are the other things that are going on in that situation. The bear's not going to wear clothes or put symbols on it that tells you how to think about it. So again, some more principles to match this step, matching the management action to the stimulus, and then striving to identify the individuals involved in interactions. The next step is developing a strategy. And in this one, really, one thing that we realized is really important to think about is the relative exposure of the animal to management actions versus visitor behavior. What are the negative consequences that managers might be able to provide through aversive conditioning? What's the volume of that relative to the rewards they might be getting either intentionally or accidentally from visitors, and how do those balance out each other, or can they? And then also the degree to which human safety is at risk. So as we started thinking about what's the whole range of potential management actions you might take if there are these problematic behaviors going on with animals, a whole group of them was really targeting human behavior. There's a whole suite of actions, area closures, food storage, compliance with those kinds of things, and they either relied on management or visitor behavior. Whereas once you have to do something to manage the animal and try to teach that animal different behavior, we're pretty limited in the kinds of things you can do. As I mentioned, conditioned taste aversion, you wouldn't really want to do with human food sources. Hazing aversive conditioning, it's kind of limited the situations that can be effective in. It can be effective if it's an animal that's really not gotten any human food rewards at all. It's curious, it's the first time it's been in a campground or a picnic area, and you can apply aversive conditioning immediately and right away. That could be potentially effective at keeping that animal from coming back. But once they've gotten the food rewards, it's really not that effective. And then once you start getting into relocation and lethal removal, those are management tools that we have. Those are just much more controversial and sort of socially difficult. So there may be some situations where you can tolerate different levels of habituation or kinds of changes in animal behavior. This is at Katmai, where you have visitors up on a bear viewing platform, so they're physically separated from the bears. The bears are really spending their time looking at focused on a hyperabundant resource of the salmon that are spawning, so there's not really too much danger from interacting with people. But you have a lot more risk in situations like here at the Grand Canyon, where it's much harder to manage all the volume of people that are there, and things like this happen where you have people getting right up to the elk. In this case, they did realize that the lawns, they're historic lawns actually around the El Tovar and the other historic hotels, those were attracting the elk. And so their management solution was to manage the habitat management action. People decided that, and put in xeriscape instead of these lawns that were attracting the elk into those areas. So the principles here again, considering the management context and the individual animal's history, recognizing that there may be times that you need to think about removal, or including lethal removal, but really needing to carefully evaluate that situation. And then the last step, piloting, implementing, and evaluating, we sort of put those all together because we felt like they were all tied to the same underlying diagnostic question and principle, which is really starting from the beginning, thinking about how are you going to measure success? Is it the animals removed and there's no problem from that individual, or is it the number of interactions you have over time? What are the things that you want to make sure that you're measuring to find out if your management actions are effective? which of course the principle that goes with that is good data helps make good management decisions. I think that's pretty self-explanatory, but one that we often think, we're putting this great management in place and it's just going to work. So those were the pieces that we pulled together for this framework for managing animal behavior. And then on the flip side, we also are now just starting to look at some principles to manage human behavior, especially because it became very apparent that that's the bulk of the kinds of things that we were going to want to be managing. And just to start off with some quotes, and you're probably familiar with some of these, but recognizing that, a lot of wildlife management is really about managing that human behavior. And when it comes to the human-wildlife interactions, there's often a lot that we need to do on the human behavior side of the equation. One thing that has become apparent in a lot of different disciplines is the idea that more information does not necessarily lead to behavior change. This sort of information deficit model, which is what a lot of people like to turn to. If you just educate people, you tell them the facts, you tell them the right thing to do, they'll do the right thing. And that's borne out in a lot of different studies that that's not always the case. There's not that direct link. And there are a lot of reasons for that. I'll just share with you one. This kind of just looks like a bad picture of people too close to elk, but there is a backstory to this, which is that it's not just people too close to elk. It's a bunch of people coming from a Human Dimensions conference where we were talking about habituation of wildlife and people, who then went out for a walk and got this close to elk. So, we obviously knew the right thing to do, but there are these other mediating things that lead to people still doing the things, even though it's not the right thing to do. In this case, there are lots of reasons we might have done it. There weren't people that we felt like we were being a bad role model around. We thought we could read the elk's behavior. I'm not sure what was going through my mind at the time. So this is it's not that clear cut and straightforward. But you have to think about all the other mediating factors. It's not just knowledge. And one theory that's used often is a theory of planned behavior, and this one has been shown quite a bit that there are certain factors that lead into intentions to behave, attitudes, perceived norms, what people think they should do, how effective they are at being able to perform those behaviors. And what we're also seeing now, though, is that there are a lot of other mediating variables. There are skills and environmental constraints and other things that play into that as well. And so even though you might have the greatest intentions, it doesn't always still end up in the expression of the behavior that you want to see. And so that's where we're starting to turn to an idea, community-based social marketing. And this is one of a number of approaches. I think what they all have in common is a founding in social psychology and trying to understand what are people's motivations, what's driving them to perform that behavior or not. And so in this case, it's being very explicit that your desired outcome is behavior. It's not increased awareness or knowledge or attitude change. It's the expression of the behavior that you want to see. And the reason for that is that sometimes you can have a behavior that is expressed that conflicts with things that people think. It's kind of weird how those pathways work, but so you have to really look at what's impeding or facilitating that behavior, and how can you encourage or discourage those things accordingly. And I'll get into that. So in this case, it borrows strategies from advertising, but the product is sort of pro-social behavior or the social good. And again, it's founded on social science research to really understand the target audiences and also sort of set you up well for evaluation. So we tried to, again, think about those same steps and diagnostic questions that could be associated with them. And I should mention these steps were ones that were developed for community-based social marketing. And I have a book with me I can show you later, but it's called Fostering Sustainable Behavior. And so that's what we were following for this, this conceptual framework. So here are the diagnostic questions. When you're selecting the behavior, in this case, it's really important to look at what is are the non-divisible end state behaviors. And I'll go through an example of what that means. But from those, you want to choose the ones that will have the most impact, the most probability that people will actually adopt them, and the ones that the least amount of people are doing already. That gives you the most chance for actually making a difference. So by a non-divisible end state behavior, what that means is that if you have a behavior that you're trying to encourage, like keep a clean campsite, that's actually a whole string of a lot of different kinds of behaviors that are balled up into that one idea. And specifically here in this example, there's sort of two behavior chains. One is correctly disposing of trash, and the other is correctly storing your food. But again, those are not just one specific behavior. In order to correctly dispose of your trash, you need to collect the trash, you need to put it in the trash can, and you need to secure the lid. And then for the food, properly storing food, you need to collect the food and other attractants, right? So some people don't know what else they need to be storing, toothpaste, lip balm, things like that. So you have to properly collect all the right things that need to be stored, put them in a container, so you have to have access to and be able to get into and open the storage container. Some people have problems with that. And then again, securing the latch. And at a training that I was at for this, we were using this as our case study, and we realized the end state behavior, the thing that really makes a difference and matters, is if the container is secured properly. If it's not secured properly, all those other things, getting the container, going through, putting everything together, bundling it, putting it in the container, if you're not securing the latch, all that doesn't matter. So you have to make sure that you're getting to the end state that is going to make a difference. So I want to take you through a little case study because I think it helps illustrate some of these ideas a little bit better. This is one from Redwoods State and National Parks, and it is actually on the marbled murrelet, which seems a little bit different from the kind of animals that we've been talking about. But there is a relationship, and I think it's a really nice example of looking at animal behavior and animal learning and human behavior and human learning that they did. So here, the murrelets are an endangered seabird, but they actually become cryptic during the breeding season, and they breed high up in the redwoods. And so this just gives you a sense of, and they didn't know where they bred until the 70s. It was not that long ago that they discovered this life cycle, piece of their life cycle. But if you look at this is where what their nest looks like, and it's very high up in the canopy in the redwoods. And so what they found was that the murrelets were suffering from nest predation, and they were trying to figure out what was causing the decline in the murrelets in the park. And so they put up nest cameras, and they found that it was predation from Steller's jays and other corvids especially that was causing the decline in the murrelet species. And when they looked at that more closely, they found that they were concentrated especially around campgrounds and picnic areas and other sources of human food. And that's what was happening, is that the jays were being supplemented by human food that was attracting them to these areas, and then it was causing the predation on the murrelets. So they wanted to find out, what's causing people to engage in that behavior, and what will motivate them to act. And so this is a step that's called uncovering barriers and benefits. And that's a good way to think about it. What's the barrier to engaging in the behavior you want to see, and what's the benefit of engaging in that behavior? One aspect of barriers and benefits, of course, can be that the drivers might be internal. It might be related to, like in this example with snakes, do you know which snake is poisonous? That could be a knowledge piece that's important, or it could be external. In the other picture here, I wonder if I can use this. Yeah, there are folks that clearly want to do the right thing. They put all their trash together, they put it in a pile, but there's nowhere to secure it. So it's not that they didn't want to do the behavior, it's an externality. So for our case study, then what they did is they did some work to figure out what is going on, what are the behaviors that are happening, and what's motivating them. So they did a visitor survey, they observed what was happening at the campsites, or throughout the park, and they did a content analysis of the interpretive materials. Because one thing they did do is they partnered with the interpreters to develop some materials about this relationship between the corvids and the murrelets and the causes of the decline and the endangered species and how they were nesting high in the redwoods. But what they found was that there actually wasn't a lot of intentional feeding. So if they had done a whole campaign around please don't feed the jays, that wasn't what people were actually doing. It was the accidental feeding, the crumbs that were left around, things like that, that were providing the food source to the animals. They also found that people wanted to know what they were supposed to do. They didn't know what they were supposed to do, but the interpretive messages were too complex. They were great interpretive messages in terms of giving people an interpretive opportunity to understand the resources better, but in terms of telling people what they're supposed to do in this particular situation, it didn't tell them that. They had to figure it out on their own. So then in thinking about developing a strategy, it's this idea of how do you best affect those identified benefits and barriers that your research would have uncovered? And there are, so again, you want to, if you think about the specific behavior, if there's a behavior you want to encourage, you want to decrease perceived barriers around engaging in that behavior, increase perceived benefits. And then on the flip side, if you want to discourage a behavior, you want to increase the perception of barriers around that and decrease the perceived benefits of engaging in that behavior. And so to do that, there's a number of different kinds of approaches that you can use, different strategies. And I'll talk about a few of these, but not all of them. They're all sort of outlined in the book too. One example is commitments, and it's this idea that people who have committed to a small change in behavior are more likely to agree to a larger request. And this is associated with the idea that people actually have a strong desire to appear consistent to others. So if you can have them commit to something small, like wearing a button that says, I like to do something, then they'll sort of internally want to be consistent with that idea. And so in this case, this is at Point Reyes National Seashore, where there were problems with people walking dogs off leash, and which was disturbing shorebirds, snowy plovers. And so the interpreters there would actually go out with dog treats, some water in a dog bowl, and they had these leashes that said, "I love walking on a leash at Point Reyes." So they're helping people who are not complying with the behavior to comply by giving them the tool to comply, but it's also with that reinforcing message, "I'm the kind of dog that likes to walk on a leash," reinforcing to their owners, of course. Another one is prompts. These are sort of visual or auditory aids that reminds people what behavior they should be engaging in that they might otherwise forget about. And so to really be effective, these need to be noticeable, self-explanatory. They need to be right where that behavior is likely to happen. So in this case, it's about closing that food storage bin, locker correctly, so it's right on the locker itself. And then again, focusing on the positive behaviors. Norms are an interesting one. Norms are sort of about telling people what they should or shouldn't do. And there's been a lot of work that has looked at the interplay between what are called descriptive norms, or what is happening on the landscape, and the injunctive norms about what should be happening. And so this example is from Petrified Forest, and they did a test. What they did is there were pieces of petrified wood that were being stolen, and they wanted to reduce the theft of the wood. And so they did some experiments where they actually marked pieces of wood and put them out, and they put out different interpretive messages with that. So the first one they tested was a descriptive norm. It said, a lot of people are removing this wood and it's changing the natural state of the forest. They also put out a control that said nothing. And then they have an injunctive norm message that said, please don't remove the petrified wood. Told them what to do. Don't take the wood to preserve the natural state of the forest. And so what they saw is that with the descriptive norm, they had 8% of the people took the marked pieces of, or 8% of the marked pieces of wood were taken. So this could be good. You have your interpretive message that's out there. You're feeling good that you're telling people that they need to, help maintain the natural state of the forest. But what they actually found is that in the control treatment, where they didn't put anything out, people took even fewer pieces of wood. So in this case, their interpretive message was kind of backfiring and actually encouraging the behavior that they didn't want to see, whereas the injunctive norm message helped reduce that theft more. And part of the reason for that is that what has been shown over and over again in lots of different studies is that people tend to go with descriptive norms, what people are doing, over injunctive norms. And this is the sort of classic study for this was in littering, where I don't know if some of you probably remember the Iron Eyes Cody ads, where there's Native American on horseback and the landscape is all littered and trashed around him, and a single tear running down his cheek, and so it's about keeping the environment clean. But inadvertently, what that's telling people is that everybody litters, so it's okay to litter. And so that's something we have to be very careful about when we're creating messages, is not to be creating conflicting messages where we're telling people the injunctive norm, but we're showing them the descriptive norm. That's actually the behavior we don't want to see. Communication is another strategy that can be used, sort of basic elements of effective communication, knowing your audience, people on vacation for parks, using credible sources, really using some thought if you're considering threatening messages, making your messages easy to remember, and then also, of course, using captivating information. And then incentives and disincentives. This is another technique you can use for behavior. In the Park Service context, we don't have a lot of times that we're giving out incentives as much as disincentives. We might use fines. But again, it's important to remember that fines are only really good if you're going to be enforcing them. If there's no chance of people getting caught and they know that, then you might as well not even have a fine that's out there. So there has to be some likelihood. People have to feel like there's some likelihood of getting caught for that to be effective. And then, of course, convenience. Again, having the infrastructure there so that can help people do that behavior. In this case, if you say that your trash cans aren't provided, it's a trash-free park, you have to carry everything out. Giving people a way to help them carry stuff out can help reduce that trash that's left behind. So in our case study, again, these are some examples of the interpretive messages that were a little bit complex for what the park wanted to achieve. Again, they found there wasn't a lot of intentional feeding, and people wanted to know what they're supposed to do. And so this was their new strategy. Their new strategy was don't bury the lead. Make it very upfront. Tell people what to do. Model the behavior you want to see. This logo shows that they want to see a clean picnic table. They want to see the birds flying away. And then this idea of consistent and ubiquitous messaging. This is a real common theme in communication. Get your messages out there often and in lots of different places and in front of people. And so that's what the park really did. They made these commitment stickers that not only had the logo on it, said keep it crumb clean. They said, I'm crumb clean. So they had that little commitment from people saying, yes, I'm the kind of person that does this behavior. The norm showing the behavior, communication, really having the same message everywhere. They even had it so that on a video, so that if people are reserving a campsite, they have to watch the video before they're allowed to make a reservation. So they're getting that message out there even before people are getting to the park. They did put in place fines and then convenience. One interesting piece with convenience that they found was that birds were actually getting a lot of their food from the stations where people were washing their dishes, and the food was washing off of their dishes and collecting in the drains, and that's where the birds would get that food. So they covered over the drains so the birds couldn't get to the food there. So again, that's not something that people were doing, but it's still an attractant from people that's bringing the birds into the campground. So in this case, for piloting, implementing, and evaluating, again, it's this idea of how are you going to measure success? What's the behavior that you want to see? And for redwoods, they really wanted to see a reduction in the Steller's jay population. And this isn't quite significant yet. The numbers only went up to 2013. They haven't analyzed everything yet. But it does look like in the campgrounds, they are showing a reduction in the Steller's jays that are being attracted there. So even though you could measure the human behavior, you could measure how much people are complying with those messages, but if really what you're trying to get at is the Steller's jays that are attracted to the food that's left by the people, then that's the metric that you want to use. So that was sort of everything that I had. A lot to cover in a short amount of time. I think maybe if we have any quick clarifying questions, we could do a couple of those now, and then we could save the sort of bigger conceptual ones for the end. And also, if anybody on the phone has any questions, feel free to type them into the questions box, and we can answer those. Yep.
I did have one question on the survey for the case that we were giving people's ideas. Did you ask them much about other ways that they were getting information outside of the park? You know what I'm getting at is you asking them to do messaging and ideas.
Yeah.
Is there a way to explore that, or is that just too far out?
Ask the question again. Yeah, you're right. So the question was on the case study survey if there were any questions on the survey about where else people might have gotten their information, especially outside the park. And I'm not sure. I don't remember exactly, but there were a lot of questions that were on there, and I think that may have been on there as well. But I can share the study with you. You can take a look at that. Yeah.
Online question.
Sure.
How do we deal with visitor-wildlife interactions for visitors that speak various languages?
How do we deal with wildlife interactions for visitors that speak different languages? That can be challenging. That's one where, I mean, I think we're often seeing a lot of different signage in other languages, but also this is where role modeling comes in, and that's that sort of social norm kind of piece. If there are things that can be used either as images or others that can get across the idea of the desired behavior that you want to see without having to use words, there are ways to do that too. So, any other clarifying questions? All right. Well, thanks, everyone.
All right, well, I'd like to thank everyone again for being here, whether you're here in person or online. It's great to be able to share what we're doing up in Kodiak. It can feel pretty isolated up there sometimes, so it's great to share it with a bigger crowd, especially in the context of what Kirsten's talking about. We're in the middle of a big 2-year study there where we're taking a human dimensions approach to looking at our brown bear viewing operation. So we're doing qualitative stakeholder interviews and a visitor survey to collect some data on our current bear viewing opportunities and be able to make some more informed decisions in the future about the kind of opportunities that we're offering. But the point of the whole thing is that it's great to have social science data and it's great to have biological data, but they work best when we look at the interplay of the two of them because as Kirsten's saying, wildlife behavior and human behavior, they impact one another. So we're really fortunate to have the time and resources to look into that and a little bit more in depth and see the interplay of the two. So I'll talk in some more detail about the study that we're working on, but I also want to give a little bit of background on the location of Kodiak. Has anyone here been up there before? No one. Okay, so perfect. I'll give some background on everything that we have going on there. And it's very different than the samples that Kirsten was giving because our visitor level is on such a different scale. So this year we didn't even hit 1,000 people that were coming for the point of bear viewing. So we're really looking at more of a quality over quantity approach, which is different than parks, but pretty fun. So I like showing maps like these because a lot of times when we see the state of Alaska, it's crammed into a tiny corner of a map and it looks really small. But in reality, what we're looking at is it takes up about 1/5 of the landmass of the lower 48, and it practically expands from coast to coast. So Kodiak Island looks pretty small in comparison to the rest of the map. But in reality, it's about the size of Connecticut, so 3,500 square miles. And there's an average of 1 bear per square mile. So we're looking at just around 3,500 bears is the most recent estimate. So pretty significant. And this is a close-up of the island. So there's 6 native villages scattered throughout the island, and most of them border the refuge in some way or another. And it's been isolated from the mainland for about 12,000 years is the estimate. So brown bears have been isolated there for that long. So they have been classified as their own distinct subspecies away from coastal brown bears that are over on the mainland. They have like a wider skull and they're just really massive in size in general. So really unique population of bears. And the human population on the island is about 14,000 people, and it's mostly concentrated up here around the city of Kodiak. And there's a really big road system that covers about 100 miles in total, and that's all isolated around this area here. So the island about fits into a box 57 by 103 miles. But when we look at our wildlife refuge, it covers about 2/3 of the archipelago. And as you can see, it doesn't get anywhere close to the road system. So if you're going out on the refuge, you're either getting there by boat or a float plane. So that's why our visitation is kind of naturally regulated in that regard. It takes a lot of effort to get there. The refuge was established in 1941, and there was a lot of pressure actually from hunters to establish this refuge because they were watching a depleting population of brown bears that was kind of being overhunted, and they really wanted to see a little bit of regulation over that. So hunting on the refuge is still a very prominent recreation activity. And I'll go back to this mission a couple of different times because it actually ties in really well with the study that we're doing now. It was founded for the purpose of protecting the natural feeding and breeding ranges of brown bears and other wildlife. And that actually, believe it or not, does tie into bear viewing and the reason that we're promoting it. And this is just an example of what it looks like to get out to Kodiak. You're not driving on any crowded park roads. You're taking a pretty cool float plane ride throughout most of the refuge, and this is what some of the views look like. So for visitors that are coming for the purpose of bear viewing, the trip out to the location is actually a pretty big part of the experience. So one of the many things that makes Kodiak a pretty unique location is, one, we have a lot of bears in general, but the food source is so incredibly plentiful that we see a different kind of behavior among these bears than we would see in somewhere like Yellowstone or Denali or really anywhere else that there's grizzlies. And so we have almost 50 million salmon that come back to spawn on the island on an annual basis. So salmon alone is an incredible food source, but they're omnivores, so berries are a huge food source, and earlier in the season, grasses and sedges make up a huge part of their diet as well. So that makes them really tolerant of each other. You can see here 3 adult bears fishing together in pretty close range. And since there is so much food around, they feel comfortable doing that. Here's a picture of like the classic salmon stash. You can see they get like a red mouth when they're eating their fish. And what that also does is it increases their tolerance to people as well. So you'll see people fishing a lot, and bears will get in relatively close range. So as a National Wildlife Refuge, we have these big 6 compatible recreation, wildlife-dependent recreation activities that we offer. So that's hunting, fishing, environmental education, interpretation, wildlife viewing, and photography. So a little bit of what that looks like in Kodiak. Hunting of brown bears still definitely happens, but we also have Sitka black-tailed deer and mountain goats, and then fishing is huge. We do an awesome job of environmental education at the refuge, and it services youth of all ages. We have a great summer camp and weekly classes that take place as well. But most of that happens in town, and especially mostly with local populations, because we don't get too much traffic coming to the island as far as tourism in that realm. So great programs, but they're happening in town, and a lot of the people that participate in those programs will never even make it out to the refuge. So it's a little bit of a different audience. And when we're looking at hunting and fishing, all of that is meticulously managed in conjunction with the state of Alaska. So they're always counting fish and really monitoring how much of the population we can be taking out. So that's pretty closely looked at as well. But when it comes to wildlife viewing and photography, there's been an increasing demand for these activities over the past few decades across the state of Alaska, but in Kodiak as well. So I stole this quote from Kirsten because it's such a good one, but good data helps make good management decisions. And we don't really have any data on, we have some data on the effects that we as people have on bear movement and bear feeding patterns, but we haven't collected any data on the effect that bears have on people. And human actions are not isolated. So even though we only have maybe 1,000 people coming to look at bears, they're going to be going to other places. So we want to see what kind of messages they're taking away from their bear viewing experience. So this is an illustration of some of the different opportunities that are currently available for bear viewing on the refuge. There's two primary ones right now, one of which is kind of this half-day viewing experience where people get flown out. It's about a 45-minute flight. They walk to a designated viewing area with a guide, and they're there for a couple hours, and then they fly out and they leave. And then we also have these multi-day excursions that go out with private guides and lodges, and it's this much more in-depth experience. The other three you see is one other area that we've permitted in the past for private guides, and we're reevaluating how to go about allowing people to experience that place. And then you can view wildlife from the water, from boats, and we also have a public use cabin system where people can go out independently and view wildlife that way. But the big thing to point out is when we're looking at these primary viewing opportunities, the wildlife behavior is different and the human behavior is different in both of these situations. So I'll get more into that, but that's important because the type of behavior that people are learning on their experience is going to be different depending on the kind of experience they're going on. And I'd like to touch a little bit on some of the biological data that the refuge is collecting that influences the type of bear viewing opportunities that are offered. Bears have been radio collared so we can track their movements and their feeding patterns. And you can see in this map in the bottom, this is an illustration from a few years back of one bear that was collared, and they just travel incredible distances. You can see they're practically going across the south side of the island. So it's great to be able to track their food sources throughout the season, and that's important to establishing bear viewing programs because a lot of times it's easy to set that kind of thing up, like the picture that Kirsten showed, along these salmon streams where there's a plentiful food source. But if we're completely reliant on that as a location for bear viewers, the problem that we have is when they switch food sources, so if they prefer berries over salmon and they're not on the river, we're going to have a lot of angry visitors that paid a lot of money to go out there and don't see any bears. But this study is also looking at salmon flows throughout the refuge, so you can see they've got some remote cameras set up on various key streams where there's significant salmon flows throughout the season, so they can actually track fish numbers compared to bear concentrations, and they do that with aerial surveys as well. So the reason that our primary location works right now is called Fraser Lake, and there's a concentration of bears that are there, and we don't quite say that they're habituated to human presence yet, but they are tolerant, and the reason to that is the large male bears don't really like to be around people, especially on a wildlife refuge where they're hunted. So in a lot of areas they can be really skittish, and if there's people around they don't want to be there. But what sows and cubs figured out is that since males don't like people, there aren't any boars in that area, which creates a safe feeding area for them. So once they realize that the human behavior is consistent, we start to see this big population that feels comfortable feeding there, and you can get within pretty close range. And I'll give a quick overview of what Fraser looks like. We have the lake, and then there's a trail that's about a mile long that takes people to this designated viewing site. And when we're talking about consistent human behavior, what that means is there's no food allowed on the viewing site. People are concentrated on this one small area where they don't leave. If you encounter a bear, the protocol is kind of standard for that location. So it's all these things that we kind of act consistently, and the bears learn to act consistently in that area as well. So this is a view of Fraser. The lake is back here. It's kind of hard to see with this light, but the trail goes around this way, and there's a naturally elevated viewing pad here. And this is a picture from our compound looking down on the viewing pad, and you can see it's a little bit different than the sample we saw before of Katmai, because there's no barrier. You're actually just sitting right there on the ground. And this is another picture of Katmai to show that difference. And this is a handout that we have available at the refuge, and it lists some of the behavior that Kirsten was talking about for good protocol for interacting with bears. And so one of the things we'll be looking at with our study is who actually reads this stuff. Is it effective? Does it actually influence how they're going to interact on site? But I like to highlight that leap on the bottom, just saying that your behavior is having a lasting effect. So even though you're not there long, it can influence the way other visitors are acting, and it can influence the way that bears are acting. So I mentioned that the human behavior at these two different types of locations is going to be different. And this is what Fraser Lake looks like. It's a very accessible trail that most people are able to walk because it's made by a four-wheeler, so it's pretty easy to get to the viewing pad. And once you're there, the way that we tend to act is if bears get too close to the pad, we don't want them up there thinking it's okay to be there. So you can kind of see over here we've got one that's getting pretty close over this way. So what the guides and everyone else do is stand up and make yourself look big. So when they get close, they kind of get intimidated and decide to back off. And that's quite the contrast to some of these multi-day trips that are going out into more remote locations, trying to have much less of an influence. So you can see on this trip, you have to have the physical ability to be walking for hours off any kind of permanent trail. And what you're doing a lot of the time is just sitting and waiting for hours and hours and hours to see if something shows up. So that's the other thing with Fraser. If people are only out there for an hour or two, they're kind of expecting this instant gratification, which obviously we just can't provide or can't expect because we can't control or predict how the bears are going to act or what time they're going to show up and things like that. But out here, you're just conditioned and you have the time to realize that it's a natural process, and you're really having a different impact. So half the time you're viewing bears from yards away through spotting scopes, and people still get really excited about that because you had to work harder for it. And then this is an example of being on the ground for one of those multi-day trips. So you're sitting for hours in kind of hidden locations in the bushes, and you're letting bears come to you, and half the time they see you and they get scared and run away. So this particular juvenile was walking along and didn't realize our group was there, and then as soon as he saw us, he turned and started running away. But what you can also see from this picture is in the background, we've got a sow with 3 koi, cubs of the year, and she has no idea that we're there, which is great because we're not adding to her stress level, we're not making her feel threatened, they can still go along with their regular patterns. And this is a photo at Fraser, so it just demonstrates different level of relaxation. So this is a sow that feels completely comfortable feeding her cubs, which is kind of a vulnerable position to be in. So she's used to people, different kind of behavior. And a thing that comes up with Fraser quite a bit of the time is some people worry that these female sows that have cubs, obviously not all the cubs are going to be female. So even though a lot of the older males don't like being around people, these male cubs are going to grow up having this level of comfort with people. So an issue that comes up pretty frequently is it ethical to hunt bears that have grown up being tolerant to humans? So that's a huge issue that we're working to see how we're going to deal with that. So to get into the study that we are doing, it's 2 different phases, and last summer we did these really in-depth stakeholder interviews. We're really fortunate to have the time to get in to do that. Originally we had planned to do a visitor use survey and just do that, but it was incredible to be able to have these interviews inform that survey, and also to create some good connections with the people that work with these bears in a different way than Fish and Wildlife does as an agency. So you can't represent every single opinion in a project like this, but we tried to get a really diverse variety. So that includes native corporations, biologists from both our agency as well as the state, the private lodge owners, the air taxi operators that are very reliant on the bear viewing industry for their businesses. So we talked to a really wide range of people. What we ended up getting was a total of 21 participants, and these interviews were recorded with their permission. Came out to 844 minutes of recordings, which were all transcribed, and it came out to just under 200 pages of transcripts. So what you do is go through and objectively code it all to certain themes. Some of the themes are emergent, and some of them were based on the questions that we asked. So we went into these interviews with semi-structured questions. So there are questions that we wanted to hit, but most of the time they would come up organically, and if they didn't, we would ask them. But they flowed more like a conversation, and the average interview time was like 48 minutes or somewhere around there, and the longest one I think was 2 hours. So they were pretty in-depth, but gave some really valuable information. And it was broken up into 6 themes, primary themes for our coding, and then like 20 sub-themes off of that, and I think like 22 additional sub-themes off of those. But what it came down to was people's opinions on the current opportunities and closures on the refuge. So there's a lot of areas that have been closed to commercial operation because they were deemed critical bear feeding habitat. And there's a lot of commercial operators that have become completely reliant on that Fraser location for viewing. And as I mentioned, that just doesn't work all the time when we can't have a reliable population of bears there. So they're really insistent on opening some of those areas. And then there's other folks that feel very strongly that they should stay closed for biological reasons. Desired characteristics of bear viewing, so all kinds of things come up with that. One of them is accessibility, so there's a lot of places like on the coast that might be good to look at bears, but things like the tide that you have to worry about. Guides don't like having to park their plane in tidal areas because they have to have 2 people go out to stay with the plane because the tide's moving in and out, so they prefer bear viewing that can happen on a lake or somewhere stable like that. Refuge relations was kind of just how people felt about refuge management and their ability to communicate with the refuge and their ability to be heard. User characteristics and issues addressed the type of people that were actually coming to the refuge. And it was great to talk to guides that have been working there for 20, 30, 40 years about the kind of people that come now versus the kind of people that may have been coming a while back, and how their expectations might be changing, or their concept of reality as in terms of what bear behavior is and how we should be reacting to it has changed. And unique aspects of Kodiak we keyed into were things from the weather we have that makes travel really difficult, the type of bear behavior we have that's different from bear behavior in other places, and the way that we want it to be managed compared to other places. So we're not a national park, so there's a lot of people that want us to have more viewing opportunities and increase this visitation, and there's a lot of people that will argue, our #1 priority is to be a refuge for wildlife. We shouldn't be encouraging more visitation. So, and lastly, bears and people. So what do people think about bears? Where are they getting their previous information from? How realistic are their expectations? So this really informed the survey that we're doing this year, and it's primarily going to be online for a couple different reasons. We have to deal with a lot of suboptimal weather, so asking people, especially if they're paying a lot of money to be out for an hour or 2, they don't want to spend 20 minutes on site filling out a survey. So what we've done is develop these 5-question survey cards, and then there's a final question on there asking if they're willing to provide more information, and then they can give us an email address and we'll contact people that way. And we're really working with our commercial air taxi operators on this, which was another big plus of our stakeholder interviews because they felt a little bit more involved in the process and they're really excited about seeing what the results of this are going to be. So the one consistent point of contact we have with visitors is through those commercial air taxi operators because obviously we don't have an entrance booth or anything like that. So what we're doing is they'll be giving these cards to every client that they take out on a bear view to fill out before they leave the air taxi area at the end of their trip. And we also have staff at Fraser Lake throughout the summer, so they'll at least be able to talk up the survey and explain what it is and encourage people to participate in that. And this is just a photo of what the bear viewing pad looks like on the ground at Fraser. So the survey is going to do a couple different things. Right off the bat, it's going to provide some data to the refuge that we've been needing just about where our visitors are actually coming from, where they're going, did they enjoy their experience, will they recommend it to others, basic questions like that. But it also gives us the opportunity to get into these kind of deeper concepts. So Powell, Kellert, and Ham developed this survey several years ago to take a look at rafting in Grand Canyon National Park. And it was developed under the premise that we can't just gauge a visitor's experience on one or two variables because there's so many things that come into play. So they were looking at the effectiveness of different guiding methods to see what kind of takeaway message people were getting from their trip. And they developed this complex interactional model to look at a bunch of different factors. So what we did is we took this model and modified it to be specific to bear viewing on the Kodiak Refuge. So you start out with this long list of independent variables. Some of the things are like length of trip. So were you out for 2 hours or were you out for 5 days? What kind of educational information did you get? Did you even see any bears? Because obviously that's a pretty big variable. And then we're looking at other things that influence it, like management approaches. So you went with a certain guide. What areas on the refuge is that guide actually permitted to go to? Because that's obviously going to influence your trip. The site that you went to, what kind of protocol are you instructed to have at that place? And then the three main things we're looking at for our dependent variables are the attitudes, behaviors, and knowledge. And it would be great if we actually had the ability to track behavior after they were on site. But unfortunately, what we have to do is rely on self-reported intent for these behaviors. But I still think there's some value in this because at least, if they are told how they should be acting in a bear encounter situation, it doesn't guarantee that they're going to act that way, but at least they have that information because a lot of people come from environments where they have absolutely no clue, so just having that information could still have an impact. A couple other things that have come up both consistently in the literature but also within our stakeholder interviews are this list of things: gender, age, your level of education, do you live in a rural or urban area. These all kind of impact the takeaway messages you might have as well as your expectations that you're bringing. So we'll be looking at those things. And finally, there's these intervening variables. So you say you have a horrible time. Is that because you were really scared of the bears you saw or because you get really sick in airplanes and you felt horrible for your whole trip? Also poor weather. I mean, all these things that could influence the type of things that people actually learn or are willing to learn while they're out there. So here's another picture at Fraser, just looking at how close you can get to bears. And I didn't think I went into it quite enough when I was comparing Fraser versus other locations. But when we're at Fraser, we kind of have that dominant mode. So if bears get too close, we're scaring them away. And if you encounter them on the trail, a lot of guides will be making noise to scare the bear off of the trail. And then these other experiences where you're out for a longer time, we're trying to have way less of an impact. And if you do see a bear, you're not really asserting dominance. You're just acting differently. So we're looking at those two different kinds of behaviors that people are told and then trying to see what that might translate to in other places. So some takeaways that I can see from this project is kind of our overarching research question is what site visitor combinations are associated with the most significant self-reported changes in your attitudes, your intended behavior, and then what you learned, not just about bears, but also the habitat that you're in and the culture surrounding that. So Alaska Native culture is something really important that we hope people will take away from this as well. And then for us as a refuge, what kind of educational materials can we be providing to manage expectations realistically before people are out there actually interacting with this wildlife? And finally, going back to our refuge mission, our ultimate goal is to protect bears and bear habitats. So people can argue that bear viewing is bad for bears because it disperses certain bears as having some kind of impact instead of just not having human presence out there at all. But if we are able to encourage this positive behavior and positive attitude changes and just giving people more positive educational information, that could have positive implications for bears along the way as well. So ultimately, when we're looking at our bear viewing management in the future, we want to be incorporating the needs of the public and the things that they want, but ultimately we're here to protect brown bears. And that is all I have. So I guess I'll take questions, and I think we have time for questions for both Kirsten and I after that as well. So.